Well, again, I'm grateful to be here for a couple reasons. Gene and I have been in some think tanks the last 2 years about the future of agriculture in Europe too, and it has gotten me thinking about why I like different kinds of food production systems for different reasons. That I have 2 greenhouses at our place, but I also have a large water harvesting fed orchard that also incorporates a lot of native plants that are food producing plants in it. And so almost every day I go back and forth between the 2 worlds of the kind of desert agriculture that Rafi was just discussing and the kind of makeshift controlled environment that those of us in the boonies of southern Arizona try to do on our own, not with the quality and expertise of many people in this room. And it gives me something to meditate on each morning in terms of the benefits and the challenges of each of those systems. Greg and I have been brainstorming for, about 16 months now, Greg, on this, what we might consider a hybrid system between open field agriculture and controlled environment agriculture. And we sort of want to test the waters to see if you all agree to us that it's a hybrid in the sense that it incorporates some aspects of controlled environment food production with some aspects of what we call natural systems agriculture. And why I think I'm most excited about this is that there's expertise in this room that could really help Greg and I in terms of fleshing out how we evaluate these pilot projects on agrivoltaic food production systems that now we've initiated. Greg started a beautiful pilot project up at Biosphere 2, and then with our friend and colleague Moses Thompson, there was efforts of 3 schools in Tucson, and we're planning one in Patagonia High down where I live at 4,000 feet south. So again, this graphic here by my longtime colleague Paul Maroka is something that emerged out of discussions probably 20, 30 years ago with the likes of Merle Jensen and Richard Felger and many people working out at the Environmental Research Lab that's by the airport, at the Desert Museum and other places, saying what elements of desert food production that have sort of been time-tried by decades, centuries, or millennia of use can be easily incorporated into something that still functions in the contemporary context. And Greg will add an additional element to this. We all know that in addition to global climate change, we have the challenge of the urban heat island effect. And when I worked up at Desert Botanical Garden, we had records showing a 4-degree centigrade nighttime increase in temperature since World War II, right where we were trying to do this kind of natural systems agriculture at Desert Botanical Garden. So there's both the challenges of the urban heat island effect that we need to deal with in terms of increasing stress on plants and increasing energy and water use, whether you're in a controlled environment or not, and the issues of how controlled environment agriculture relates to what we do in the face of global change. So let's get started. And I'm going to do a very short introduction and let Greg move us ahead. Which clicker? There's about 5 up here. It's an embarrassment of riches here. There we go. There we go. So let's start off with some of the very basics about comparing the benefits and relative costs. Neither system is perfect, and both are productive, of natural systems agriculture. And in that case, I'm not talking about conventional field agriculture, but some systems like what the Land Institute is doing in Kansas, the Savannah Institute is doing in Wisconsin, where you use the natural ecosystem as a model to design an agriculture fit to a particular landscape. And all this slide really points to is that there's challenges with each of those. You may have more embedded energy in a controlled environment agriculture system, but you're doing that to have higher yield per unit area and greater environmental control over the crop production. With field agriculture, you're usually trying to reduce the inputs, and it's a much more extensive system, lower yield per unit area, of course, but you have advantages in addition to lower inputs. You have some avoidance of pests just by the spatial heterogeneity, and you're capable of mixing annuals and perennials, which I do in my orchard with understory plants below the fruit trees. So there's advantages and disadvantages, and some very distinctive things. Most field agricultural systems are just never going to get the yield and quality control of controlled environments. But some things that consumers are interested in now, for instance, the terroir, or the taste of place, is less likely to get in either aquaponics or in certain kinds of controlled environment systems. But that may not be a big deal, since that's of interest to only certain, a few species of crops relative to all the crops that we want to grow in controlled environment agriculture. So I'm not telling you anything new. I'm just saying that now and then it's good to take a step back and make these comparisons between the structure and function of different kinds of food production systems and see what we gain or lose by moving one way or the other. Okay. Well, what is natural systems agriculture? This term I've already used 3 times without defining. This is a definition that's come from the Land Institute that was started 50 years ago by my friend and MacArthur Fellow colleague Wes Jackson in Salina, Kansas, and that an Arizonan is now running the research program for today, and that's Tim Cruz, who used to be up at Prescott College, got his PhD in agroecology from Cornell years ago. So it is something that uses the natural ecosystem as a model for what we might call biomimicry design, that you don't have to use mesquites and saguaros for your food production system, but you might want to look at combining leguminous trees and some succulents, other columnar cacti, like I'm using Peruvian columnar cacti under carob trees at my own place, rather than saguaros and mesquite like we see in the desert where I have my office on Pinnacle Hill. So this is sort of metaphorical thinking, if you'll indulge me in that for a moment. And in particular, the Land Institute says we need to reduce the environmental and energy costs of excessive tillage in field agriculture. And why not do that by investing more in precision plant breeding for perennials? So they've really advanced both the adaptability of perennial grasses as grain crops for a kind of perennial field agriculture in a matter of 15 years, quadrupling, and in one case, I think, increasing yields about 10 or 20-fold. It's not necessarily, stopping progress by saying, let's go back to nature. It's really using the elements of the prairie ecosystem, doing precision plant breeding, looking at mixes of crops in polycultures that in ways echo what we see in natural ecosystems that may reduce pest and disease problems and reduce soil tillage. That's what, in essence, what the Land Institute is about. And we just visited their 1,000-acre site in Kansas. Probably 150 PhD and master's thesis people are now working on the domestication of perennial grasses and their inputs, their integration into perennial polyculture food production. So this is not something that is economically viable yet, but their one perennial grain called kernza is now available as a cereal grain for pancake mixes and as a whiskey in California. So if any of you don't like the local food movement, but you still want good local drinks, producing Kernza for your own whiskey may be an option. The point is here that this is not sort of some romantic notion of let's take things out of nature and just throw them together in a mix and see if it works. They have very good plant breeders and very good agroecologists looking at how to integrate these using other elements of agriculture. And they do a lot of controlled environment production on their site as well. They have about $3 or $4 million of greenhouses that they do for some of their plant breeding and their mixes of species with to see if there's allelopathic effects and other things like that. So you can read the definition, but I think you get the big picture there. Whoops, I am doing the wrong thing here. I may need to be controlled at every stage, you know. There we go. Where did I go? Okay, there we go. Okay, so now that was the original contrast set, controlled environments and natural systems agriculture. But Greg and I are going to focus today on what in some ways we could say is a food production system that integrates components of each of those elements. And the basic idea is that we have a lot of photovoltaic arrays already built in the West in areas where the urban heat island effect and global change is already affecting the temperature thresholds for flowering and fruit set of many of our crops. Some of the crops that I worked on when I did my master's and PhD at Cal, like dry beans, already inside the canopy, the temperatures are getting above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. We're getting blossom drop and reduced yield. So can we use the shade of photovoltaic arrays at minimum to deal with those issues of buffering our high-value crop plants? I'm particularly interested in seeing how this plays out for medicinal herbs that we've talked about, for nutraceuticals, if you want to call them that, things like chia and stevia, and for high-value multi-cutting culinary herbs that local restaurants want. It seems like that's where you'd want to use these kind of systems for to begin with, because you have a good return on your structural investment. The second part of that is that you're generating renewable energy on the very same space that you're producing food. And already farmers in the Imperial Valley are having to make a choice. Should we, our water costs are going up, our pumping costs are going up, should we really rent our acreage out to Southern California power companies to do energy production on our lands, or should we grow food? And we say, why not do both? That they're already at the temperature threshold for most of their summer crops, so winter production is what's really been lucrative in the Imperial Valley and in the Canyon. The third thing is that these are surfaces for harvesting water, and some of the pilots that Greg has been involved in is doing some problem solving on how we capture the water off the photovoltaic array. So you could harvest water, harvest sun for photovoltaic energy production, and harvest crops on the very same space. That's nice as abstract concept, but doesn't give us any advantages. That's what we're aiming for. Okay, and again, there's a really healthy literature. What would you guess, Greg? Maybe 20, 30 technical papers now, or not even that much, or yeah, maybe 12 to 15 that have looked at these agri-photovoltaic systems in Portugal, France, a couple other countries. There's 2 states here, besides Arizona that are investigating these things that Greg will talk about for very different purposes than our own. And I should just mention, it's here in one of the slides, that we have 3,500 photovoltaic arrays over schoolyards, parking lots, churchyards, etc. in Tucson already. So here's structures, some of them bigger than this room, that the space underneath the arrays is not being utilized except for parking lots. So about half those 3,500 are to give shade to cars in parking lots, and the other half are in schoolyards, basically over hard-packed dirt. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, a little later. So let me go this way. So, the question that we'd like to have in discussion with you today after Greg presents some more details about the system is the research on these agrivoltaic based food systems, a possible bridge between what you all have gleaned in your terrific work on controlled environment food production and some elements of natural systems agriculture. And in particular, I've been very, very interested in work that Greg and I and many of our colleagues have done in a field of ecology called nurse plant ecology, where we look at how basically all the cacti and succulents and many of the herbs that we're used to when we do a hike in the desert start their lives out under just 4 species of desert legumes, mesquite, blue palo verde, foothills palo verde, and ironwood trees. And these provide a buffered environment both from catastrophic freezes and from high summer temperatures, sometimes as much as 8 to 10 degree buffering from extreme temperatures either way in the winter or the summer. But nurse plants also provide mycorrhizal connectivity that helps recruitment and establishment of these plants. It's a richer soil moisture environment, so there's many benefits of nurse plants in addition to simply the shade that they provide. So one of the exercises we've done is what can we learn by looking at these nurse plant guilds, as Forrest Shreve called them 100 years ago up at the Desert Lab on Tumamont Hill, and how can we learn how they function in deserts and apply that to agriculture. These other points we can come back to later if you want, but I think we get the picture with that one. So again, here's an old paper by Forrest Shreve on the recruitment of saguaros and other desert plants under the shade of nurse trees. And we know there's systems like this in other parts of the world with Gliricidia sepium, the Madre Cacao tree. About a third of all the coffee production in Latin America is still under the shades of Madre Cacao and Lucena and other tropical legumes. Some production systems use shade cloth now and all of that, so it's not all coffee is produced under nurse trees, but nevertheless, this has been a functional agroforestry system in the Americas for centuries, if not millennia. And at my place, I did a book 3 years ago called Growing Food in Hot and Dry Land. We're doing things where we're growing romaine lettuce in the winter under mesquite trees, and as the mesquite leaves come on the trees in late March and early April, compared to our control plots with no shade, we're getting 5 weeks more of harvest because there's slower bolting of the romaine lettuce because of the cooler, more shaded environment. So, I mean, it's actually not that much different than what our wonderful Tucson Village Farm is doing with the shade cloth canopies for vegetable production about 200 yards from here. But nevertheless, you can do the same thing with the desert nurse plants and vegetable production here. And I just prune up all the mesquite trees into sort of lollipop type canopies and then grow herbs or succulents underneath. So again, I think I spelled principles wrong there, but is there a way that we can take that huge knowledge from the U.S. and Mexico about nurse plant ecology and apply it to multi-strata food production systems? And we know that we reduce the abiotic stresses on understory food crops by doing that in natural systems and in agricultural systems. But there's some really interesting things that need exploration about how that reduced heat stress reduces the proliferation of viral diseases on the understory plants. So things like tomatillos, physalis, Philadelphia, I simply cannot grow in open sun in Arizona, even though I used to think of it as a southwestern crop. It just gets viruses almost immediately, tobacco mosaic and tomato mosaic viruses. And in the shade, I just don't have any viral problems with it. And I think it's a temperature stress that triggers the expression of the virus, or at least the severity. So there's some biotic stresses that deserve attention in these systems too. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Greg. As my wife once said, either going to put on my epic never.
Before Greg starts speaking, I want to do a better introduction of Greg because I gave him very short shrift earlier this afternoon. So Greg Barron-Gafford is an associate professor in the School of Geography and Development, and his expertise lies in the interface between the forces that are the physical forces that act on plants, including human effects acting on plants, and on the other side, knowledge about the structure of leaves, the structure of plants, and how the two interact in order for the plants to survive and to flourish. And so he is going to use knowledge to bridge between what Gary just told us about and apply it to a joint project, as Gary said, at Biosphere 2. So now it's all yours.
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right. Okay, thanks. Yes, and it's great to be here talking to all of you, professional growers. When I first submitted this proposal to NSF, they said one of the reviewer comments was the PI has extensive experience, published research in killing plants, not in growing them, which is true because we do a lot of climate change type stress studies on mortality of trees and whatnot. So point taken. So now that's one reason to be working with the desert sage of Gary Nabhan. So I do tend to work in the natural environment, and one of my biggest projects is thinking around grassland savannas and woody plant encroachment and what that means for carbon and water fluxes and how the ecosystem functions. And we were measuring this idea of a nurse tree. You know, what were those plants doing growing under there? Because I would have presumed that it was wetter under that soil, right? There's less sun coming through hitting the soil, and so every time it rained, if you think about if you spilled your water bottle in the shade versus out in the open, where does it stay wet longer? In the shade. And so we presumed that those plants were not only enjoying the temperature difference, but a moisture relief. But by measuring the sap flow within the mesquite, we found that it's a very competitive relationship. The mesquites are actually water hoarders. They're stealing all of that water. Let's not overdo it. They're taking up all that water, stashing it really deep in the soil profile through something called hydraulic redistribution. And when it's dry, they bring the water back up, but instead of sharing it, they use it mostly to keep themselves going. And so it's very competitive from a water side. So I've got that in one mind. And the other part of my brain is wondering about solar heat islanding, the solar heat island effect, which is again, working out in the natural environment, we have these things called eddy covariance towers or ecosystem monitoring stations. And someone said, well, do you think you can apply that to a large solar array and see if they're creating a heat island effect? And we said, sure, let's try that. And it worked. And so we monitored it for about a year using the solar tech zone at the technology park that U of A operates down by I-10 and Houghton. And we found that the solar areas do create a heat island effect. They're on the order of a couple of degrees warmer during the day and quite a bit warmer at night. And so before we published that paper in Nature, we wanted to not go on the record and have that twisted into renewable energy creates global warming by certain channels. And so we thought, what's going on here? What's causing that? So between thinking about those two things, I kind of came to this agrivoltaics idea and then learned that Gary had been thinking about it since, I was in diapers. And so another one of those times where you could tap into the stage and just start running with it. So in case you haven't gathered yet, agrivoltaics is simply a mashup of agriculture and photovoltaics. And so we're really trying to look at this potential for reintroducing vegetation into solar arrays. In a typical PV installation or photovoltaic installation, they've laid off all the plants. And as people who work with plants, they transpire, so they create a cooling effect. They're doing lots of photosynthesis. They're scrubbing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And I wanted to know, what was in that relationship that we weren't accounting for, and how might co-locating these two things yield some benefits? And this is what the first pilot area up at the biosphere, which Tilak may recognize off to the side there. And so we've got a solar photovoltaic array elevated so that we can work underneath. It's raised about 10 feet off the ground so the tractors can move through here if they needed to. We largely use them when we're bringing in fresh loads of compost and starting over new seasons because we were doing that by hand, and then I was letting the undergrads were doing that by hand, and the day that I went to help, I thought, why are we doing this by hand? There's machines. And so now we use that. So we think that this novel approach may actually lead to some win-wins. So increased renewable energy production, increased food production, and reduced water use. So I'll step you through each of those. And so Gary mentioned that a couple of other states are looking at this. Actually, the National Renewable Energy Lab has just given us a small pool of money, about $30,000 to explore this as their kind of southwest test site. The other ones are up in Oregon, which are just being developed. They're not even online. And the other one's up in Boston, where you think about they don't have all the space that we have. They're very limited in terms of space. And if you're going to add renewable energy production, what's going to give is probably the food production. And so they're wondering about co-location opportunities. And there the projects really are, if I stick solar panels over my crops in a very energy-limited place, what's the negative impact of that? How bad is it really? And so they're thinking about it more from that side. How big of a negative impact is having shading? Where here, we're applying something we've observed in nature, this idea that there is shading going on out there that helps with keeping plants going. All right, you've got plant physiology in the room, right? You've seen these kinds of measurements, have you? Okay. I'm in the geography department now. If I showed this, they would wonder what are you talking about? So we all know that plants need light, right? But you also are probably familiar with the fact that plants don't continue to increasingly do photosynthesis as you increase the light. At some point, it's different reaction rates are saturating, and there's a plateau, right? And beyond, if you get way out here, you can actually do damage to the plants, and they start to shut down. Does that make sense? You guys with that? So this is our PAR, our photosynthetically active radiation level, here in Tucson. And under the photovoltaics array, because people always say, isn't it shady under solar panels? Yes. If you go underneath them, just like going under your carport, you can still read, right? You read on your porch, plants still grow on your porch. And it's because of this, the fact that you can have, a 2/3 reduction in your light, but because of how plants work, you're not necessarily experiencing that much of a severe reduction in their photosynthetic activities. And not every plant has the same light response, right? So there's lots of variation among species. The response can vary if plants are water stressed or not water stressed. So this is a very plastic response. And what really struck me was thinking about, agricultural species. And plants in drylands have all kinds of cool adaptations to this excessive light, right? Cacti have got these needles. We've got dryland plants largely having smaller leaves, so they're not overloaded with light. Jojoba grows up and down like this. You notice the leaves are more up and down, so they get that morning light, which is kind of kind. And the hellacious light that's overhead, especially in the summer, they're just avoiding it. But as people who grow food plants, those food plants don't have those adaptations. And so how do they deal with it outside? By us giving them lots of water. And so there's a little bit of something we're playing with there. Maybe instead of giving them so much water, there's other adaptations we can introduce, like maybe growing in some shade, like in a nurse tree. Okay, so here's that same light response curve of photosynthesis. Here's a temperature response curve of photosynthesis. This is just, actually this is from a mesquite tree, but this could be any kind of plant. You could do these types of measurements with a portable photosynthesis machine. Some of you may have done that. And here, this is just to illustrate, plants have an optimum. Get too cold and they don't do as well. Get too hot, they don't do as well. And so if we can create an environment that brings it cooler, you're going to increase their photosynthetic rates. And one of my questions as a plant physiology person was, if I've got this reduction in photosynthesis because I've got less light, is it made up for the fact that they're growing in a more moderate temperature environment? Again, so this is where we did this. I've blown up the picture a little bit more. Up at Biosphere 2, we have this, I want to say 40 by 40 foot area covered in solar panels and an equally large control agricultural area where since this time last year we've been growing plants. We did some winter crops with the kale, chard, potatoes, rainbow chard, because one chard wasn't enough, cabbage, green and purple, because the tour guides who run the place said, we'll make you things if you grow cabbage. They wanted it, so we did it. We thought, let's try tomatoes because, sometimes down here we grow tomatoes through the winter if we have a mild winter. And similar to Gary's point, just an aside, I didn't include a picture of pests. Every time it would freeze out here, and they're at 5,000 feet there, these plants would get wilty, done, start over, reinvest in above ground growth, and even being 10 feet off the ground, it never frosted underneath these panels. And I was really unsure. Actually, there's a conference we go to every year, the American Geophysical Union meeting. So I was out of town. I saw in the news that we had these freezes, and I thought, oh no. But then I thought, no wait, we actually want it to freeze so that we can see how well this is working. And it did well. And when those plants came back after that repeated temperature stress, a lot of these open plants started to get aphids. No aphids under the other one. And I don't get that because if I was a bug, I would hide in a warmer place, right? But it's not where the bug's looking for habitat, it's where the plants are allowing it. Okay, so I'm a plant physiology person in a geography world, and so I measure photosynthesis a lot. Are you familiar with this tool, the Lycor 6400? Anybody? Maybe a couple? Okay. So this is our portable photosynthesis machine. And so it's like having a portable biosphere where you can dial in the relative humidity, the carbon dioxide levels, set up the light, set up the temperature, and you can control the environment that you're measuring this plant within. And that's how I did some of those other response curves here. So what we did is we matched the local environment of under the agrivoltaics or out in the open, and you can see everyone always huddled under here. Getting to that last win, which could be worker rights, and thinking about where we have so much heat stroke and heat-related death in food production. What if suddenly you are not baking in the sun all day? Never mind, the possibility of increased production and labor effects just from working in a better environment. But I digress. So what we're looking at here is some of our summer crops. The chiltepine, the little spicy pepper. That's one thing you add when you work with the desert sage, who helped found Native Seed Search. Jalapeno, which was fun to see the undergrads say, I've heard of jalapeno, I've never heard it, it's probably not even spicy. And then they eat the chiltepine and find that it is. Okay? And tomato, that's another really great one to work with because, I mean, as you know, if you don't grow the tomatoes inside a controlled environment out in the open, they might flower, but they abort, and you don't get fruit production throughout the summer down here. And so one thing that kept happening is we were measuring when it was convenient. So it's about an hour drive to the biosphere. I dropped my kid off at the daycare over at Glenn and Campbell, finally make it to the biosphere, get everything out. We were measuring from like 10 to noon every day. We were measuring these photosynthetic rates being a little bit greater out in the open area, so the control, than they were under the solar voltaics array. So they're thinking, okay, their plants are acquiring more carbon out in the open, but then they were constantly bigger out under the agrivoltaics area. So that didn't jive. How are you acquiring less carbon but getting bigger? So I've started to wonder, are they allocating less to roots and root shoot allocation or something? Then I thought, well, maybe it's just the time of day we're measuring. It's a little bit brighter and not quite as hot at 10 in the morning. Maybe that's just their good time. In come the REU students, the Research Experience for Undergrad Students. We have a program up at Biosphere where they live there. And so I asked them if they would measure all day. And because they hadn't done it before, they said sure. And so we measured from 4 a.m. until 8 p.m. so we captured the sun coming on and the sun going off and everything in between. And so this is net photosynthetic rate at these hourly points throughout the day. You go to this graph, it's where we've looked at cumulative carbon uptake, per day, per meter square of leaf area, in the open versus the PV. And we got the better picture of explaining that bigger biomass under the agrivoltaics, where the chiltepine is acquiring more carbon per day in the agrivoltaics area. Jalapeno, it's barely significantly different. It's about 9% less. The tomatoes, quite a bit more. Then this value, called water use efficiency, is more than anything, it's photosynthesis divided by transpiration. So the carbon gain per water loss. Does that make sense? And so you can see the water use efficiency was not that different in chiltepine. Jalapeno is saving quite a bit more water per unit carbon uptake. So it's way more efficient. Tomatoes, more efficient. And so what this is telling us is that those plants, especially jalapeno and tomato, are able to do more with less. They're doing more carbon uptake without losing as much water. Okay, so that's why its running title of that may have been, why might this be good for agricultural plant production? And this is looking at it from the carbon uptake potential. Another point is, as Gary was mentioning, we're extending the phenology of these areas. So we've been planting carrots under the agrivoltaic area since August, when you don't plant carrots here until like late October, November. But because we've changed the seasonality, because we've actually got a cooler environment under these solar panels, water is staying in the soil longer, and so we're able to extend what's going on here. We've got chiltepine that are still just as happy as they were 2 months ago as they are now. Basil is still unbolted under agrivoltaics, whereas it's really not that good to taste anymore. But we have visitors taste it so they can be convinced that there's a difference between bolted basil and regular basil. Okay, so moving on, why might this be good for energy production? First, remember that I mentioned that those large-scale areas create a heat island effect. Well, one, that's not good because if we get much hotter as a place, we're going to be less prone to being a site for renewable energy production. Some of the renewable energy forecasts are that energy production should move more up to Colorado area. The other part is that getting too hot is bad for a solar panel. So this is a measure of their efficiency against temperature. So out here it's relatively plateaued, but as they get beyond 30 degrees Celsius, they reduce their efficiency by about 0.6% for every 1 degree increase in temperature. And so again, if we can move these temperatures to a cooler point, they will get more production. So why would that be? I know it's 5, but if you're still up for learning some vocabulary, here's 2 words for you. Maybe you've heard of them anyways. Have you heard of latent heat versus sensible heat? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, so latent heat is the energy that it takes to move liquid water to water vapor. So that's happening in your tomato plants every time they transpire. Liquid water inside, water vapor around them. So energy comes into a system. Remember that first law of thermodynamics? Energy comes in, it has to leave some way. It can leave through sensible heat, the heat that you can feel. In this picture, it's the orange arrows, like the ground getting hotter, heat radiating off the surface. The blue arrows are the latent heat, water pools evaporating, plants transpiring. And in a typical photovoltaic area, they've gotten rid of all the plants. So there's no way for energy to leave the system through latent heat, so it has to leave through sensible heat, right? Energy that came in has to go out. There's one less pull for it to leave, and so it's leaving through the sensible heat. And that jives with the fact that we were measuring these were hotter environments. And so then we wondered, can we just stick some latent heat fluxes back into the system, which is a fancy way to say, we know that plants are like little evaporative coolers out there. It's cooler when you go past a farm at night. That's what you're feeling, the difference between less sensible heat being released to the atmosphere. So we're trying with some restoration and food production. But the question was, can such a simple concept really yield any kind of measurable effects? And of course, no one thought so until we measured it. And the way we measure that is putting little thermocouples or little temperature probes on the solar panels that measured how hot they are, which is related to efficiency. And this is data fresh off the electronic press. Just got this together yesterday. So what we're looking at is May and June. And on the top is the panel surface temperature, that thermocouple reading. In red is the traditional PV panels, so solar panels that are ground mounted in the typical array. In blue is the skin temperature of those agrivoltaic panels. And this bottom one is the difference, agrivoltaic minus traditional. So a low number means the agrivoltaic panels are cooler, and that means warmer. What do you notice, class? Yeah, during these days when these temperatures are rising, the agrivoltaic panels aren't getting as warm at all. In fact, they're somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 degrees cooler at those peak periods. So now we could be really talking about something related to the efficiencies that the renewable energy folks are caring about. And when I mentioned this to a guy who works at NextEra Energy, he said, that's great. We buy this land and we're only concerned with the overstory. If we can do something else like rent the land back to the farmer, then maybe we don't have to take food out of production. If we can figure out how to do this in a really reasonable way. And that leaves me with this last slide. We're trying to consider this, in terms of broader ecosystem services. I'm not sure if it's a concept you've heard of, but it's the idea that ecosystems do lots of things from us. They do tangible things like produce biomass. They do intangible things like changing the environment in a certain way. So there's little transpirational or no transpirational cooling in this traditional PV system, but in an open field, you've got that latent heat flux from grasses. You can get some of that carbon sequestration and all of these things. And so we're starting to try to inform some of our hypotheses about how A plus B might yield a really good C in either a restored restored PV photovoltaic area or an agrivoltaic kind of environment. I think that, then I'll leave you with pictures of cute kids, because who doesn't like them? So Gary mentioned that we're also doing this at a few schools. This are pictures from Monzo Elementary, which is on the west side of Tucson, just south of the school for deaf and blind. And it's one of these places where they had solar panels out on their school grounds. And if you drive around, maybe you can do this. This will be your homework. You don't have to report back. But drive around town, and when you look at these Do? Okay. When you see these PV systems, notice the grass, the Bermuda grass that's under there. I think you'll see that it's still green, whereas a lot of the other grasses are browning. And it's because it's staying warmer at night, that part that you saw where it's going above zero. And so essentially, yeah, it's still October under there at night and in the day. And so we're using, sage seeds, not literally, and growing these plants, again, in a under agrivoltaic array and in an open array. And the students are actually taking the measurements. They're doing real measurements of plant biomass, temperatures and moistures. And consequently, because they have a greenhouse and they grow a lot of plants, they're our source for plants for our biosphere experiments. So not sure how it's going to work when we try to write this first paper, and there's 22 fourth graders. How do you deal with co-authorship there? But it's kind of a fun problem to have. So now I think we would love to hear your thoughts on how this might be kind of an in-between your hyper-controlled environment and some of the challenges and benefits that you see, and our transition from traditional ways of doing agriculture to take on this idea of biomimicry and kind of unconventional connecting of pieces to get into a semi-controlled area. Thanks.
Please wait to have the microphone before you start asking the question.
It's great.
Okay, so I think this was really a unique presentation that shows what's going on either side of what used to be, at least the way I was thinking about it, divide. You want to do traditional agriculture, you have to follow what happened 1,000 years ago. It has no application to today. And this is what you guys are bridging, and I think it's genius. I love it.
The real genius is that last point, that this is, whether this is an economic system or not, immediately, it is such a good learning lab for our kids to learn about the urban heat island effect, to learn about how shade not only affects worker comfort and heat stroke and heat stress among farm workers is increasing exponentially in Arizona because of the high peaks in temperature we're getting these days. So there's a whole lot of social, environmental issues that we can teach kids about right in their schoolyard, because these solar photovoltaic systems are all over the place. So in the least, this is an incredible way for all of us to teach ecological principles of agriculture to our communities.
I'm not really a scientist as far as all this goes, but I was wondering if there's any relationship to the height of where these solar panels are to what's working. I mean, we know we have a roof, we have heat that kind of generates downward at Rito, at the farmer's market. They have that big metal thing, but when you go there during the summer, it's very hot. And I know these are cooler, but is there any relationship to the height, like how much light then still kind of suffuses underneath that?
That's a great question, and one of the things we proposed, I'm investigating if we can put forth a proposal to NSF for this. It's called Infuse, Innovations at the Nexus of Food, Energy, Water, because we're working on food, we're working on energy and water savings. And yes, I wondered, like, you can see how dense the panels are here, and that's just because that's how we tend to do solar PV installations here. The installations for the test yard that National Renewable Energy Lab is doing in Boston would be one panel where I am and maybe a panel where Rafi is, so very spaced out. So I think there is something to play with there in terms of efficiencies on all ends. I'm sure there are some things related to that we haven't explored.
The thing that comes to mind with the nurse plant ecology studies is that
our catastrophic freezes that affect tomato production all the way down into single one every 5 years is due to re-radiation up from the crop into an open sky in the winter. And so having a nurse plant or on a photovoltaic array keeps that heat in place in the night, but there's going to be differences in that efficiency depending on how high that PV array is that I think deserves study as well.
Dovetail on that to say that turns out to be what's causing the heat island effect of the solar panels is that re-radiation. As soon as you get outside of the photovoltaic array, that heat island effect goes away. It's the same of having the cloudy nights versus an open sky. The panels are essentially the cloudy night that are trapping that re-radiation.
I'd like to ask a question. I noticed in this drawing here on the bottom of this page, that it looks like you have some sort of rain gathering system and tanks from the water off that are coming off the panels. When you give your information about how much cooler it is under those panels and understory, and there's growing things there versus not having anything underneath. Of course, making a huge factor by watering those plants under there. That's another complicated piece of information to factor in there. It's not just the plants transpiring, it's the water you're putting out there that's making the difference. Can you say something about that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we've designed the irrigation system so that we're delivering equal amounts of water in the open versus under the agrivoltaic area. Two asides with that is one thing that we're doing in the installation that we just started planting yesterday up at Ice. We just started over with a new winter garden, is we set up two different irrigation systems where half of the plots under PV and half of the open plots will get regular water, and the other one we can dial back the water by, I want to go big and just say half. And then we can see in those beds, not only carbon uptake per day, but total production differences. One hint that the water really is truly lasting, every irrigation event is lasting longer, is in the open you do, let's say if we were doing a daily irrigation, you can see the soil moisture, and we're measuring with soil moisture probes, go through this spiky nature where it was depleting, each day. That depletion was much more gradual in the agrivoltaic area. The Biosphere is having a big Earth Day festival back in April, and to get ready for that, someone disconnected our irrigation system. Yes. And so when I got to on Earth Day, that day we were harvesting all the vegetables, giving it to the public. The open plants looked terrible. If I went and checked the data logger, the irrigation had stopped 9 days before that. And so you can imagine that was a problem for the open plants. But the plants under the agrivoltaic area were still upright. There's no wilting. And so I called my technician. I said, when you come up, bring the LIPOR photosynthesis machine. We need to see how these plants are doing. And so that's part of the reason we want to have these instrumented beds that are going through different sequential levels of irrigation.
Let me just mention a complement to Greg's original entry point, which was looking at the urban heat island effect and the negative of all these photovoltaic arrays around. I was first called about 5 years ago by a solar company in Washington, D.C. that looked like they were going to get the bid to put solar photovoltaic panels on the flats below the mine spoil south of Santa Bear Mission. And in their pilot projects, they were finding greater erosion of very erodible lands just above the Santa Cruz River floodplain. Think about monsoon water droplets hitting a hard surface like a panel and then hitting barren ground. And so their solar photovoltaic arrays have the potential of increasing soil erosion at the base of the panels. And they asked me for a pre-proposal to just grow pollinator plants for honeybee honey production underneath the panels. They say, we don't want food for us, we want food for the bees. We'll contact with bee growers to either rent the land or just make it happen. But the point, I think, is really, really interesting, that having a soft surface both helps with the actual absorption of heat, but it also, if you look at any of these school photovoltaic arrays, it's this hard, ugly soil surface that you think no one will ever be able to grow anything on this. It's just bad. And so we don't have any tilth per se. We just have this, all the good soils washed away, and we just have this hard silt crust cap that just the water bounces off of.
I was wondering if you looked at the soil microbial communities, or if you have plans to do so.
If you're offering, I would take you up on that. So, yes, thanks. Thanks for the offer. Next. No, actually, so Rachel Gallery is a microbial ecologist in the natural resources, and I've approached her and Laura Meredith, who's measuring trace gas fluxes from soils. I recently learned that from a guy named Joey Blankenship, who's just joined SWES, that carbon aggregates are really depleted in soils that aren't going under agriculture anymore, like abandoned lands. And so that's another way of like long-term carbon storage. And he gave a presentation, and I immediately wrote him and asked, he's just arrived here in the last year, so he's being approached by everybody that runs into him. But I think that would be another great experiment, because we're certainly changing the potential phenology of all these soil organisms. No doubt about that, in terms of moisture status and everything. Are you wondering because you have a particular question or more curiosity? Okay, great.
Yeah, Gary and Greg, thank you for the great presentation. I think that this represents a very promising strategy in terms of optimizing, maximizing land use efficiency. But Greg, I'm curious about one detail. So you've got these panels, and you've got the plants underneath. The sun is moving throughout the course of the day, and so the shadows are moving, the light is moving. Did you ever measure the average amount of solar radiation per day that an average plant underneath the panel is actually receiving?
Yes, and that's how I got where I put the little sun shape on the graph. So yeah, we had a PAR sensor, a photosynthetically active radiation sensor, in the middle of our array. And all of our measurements we set up to only use the center portion of it, and really treated the edge like edge effects.
But in that graph, though, the PPF, photosynthetic photon plots on the horizontal axis, is like instantaneous reading.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Right, but I'm thinking about the cumulative,
Right.
the total amount of solar radiation, the daily lighting integral.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we did do measurements under that ambient, whatever it was, through time. And I think a really good thing might be to look at light use efficiency. So total PAR throughout a day versus total carbon uptake. That's a
That's
great
what I'm
suggestion.
curious to find out, because it's not just the light, but as you said, it's the reduced temperature underneath the panels that help or work together to improve the crop productivity.
That's a great way to try to get at distinguishing those two. Yeah, thanks.
Another interesting insight into this that on about 10 years ago is that Australian plant physiologists have looked at that accumulated PAR light function with chilies and other crops in open fields and artificially shaded canopies for years because they're facing temperature thresholds. And they demonstrated that most cultivated chili peppers only need about 60% of the total accumulated PAR during the day for optimum yield. So it's not just you're increasing the stress if you have ambient light, but you're really not keeping them in that optimal range, and some of your slides suggest that too. So we can, I mean, what I'm saying is we don't have to start from scratch with this problem solving. There's studies out there done for different reasons that we can apply to this in a really interesting way to get at the very question you're asking. So I think this is just such a beautiful opportunity for what we might call pure and applied science, desert ecology and agricultural ecology, to join forces in a way that would be such a great teaching experience about the basic agricultural principles of abiotic and biotic stresses on our food production.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Thank you.
Time for one more question.
All right. Mark, thinking about biomimicry, in desert systems, you've got nurse plants as a sort of core phenomenon in deserts, but you also have plant spacing as a core phenomenon of deserts, and it seems like that is that's got some parallels with your photovoltaics as well. And so some of what you're talking about as water harvesting is it's a form of water redistribution because of plant spacing. I'm wondering what else we could sort of learn from that literature, how else we could apply the sort of plant spacing literature.
So Greg already pointed out that we're increasing the available potential moisture in the soil below nurse plants, but there's incredible competition, and we all understand that, at some level, that there's these trade-offs. Greater moisture holding capacity because we have more detritus under mesquite trees and far better soil in terms of moisture holding capacity, but then you've got a lot of plants that are competing for that. Then we have, on the other side of the most extreme deserts, that near even spacing of creosote bushes or of bursates, triangle bursates, and many other desert plants where really they're doing their little micro water harvesting units where plant productivity and extremely arid deserts just can't get above a point because it's water limited. So I think that what you're saying is really interesting, this issue of how we space not just photovoltaic arrays, but how we space the distribution of irrigation under them or on the edges of them is going to be a really significant thing to make this economic yields where we're not either watering or light limiting the plants, but optimizing both. So thank you, and again, thanks, Greg. Yeah. Be any crazier than we are.
I used to spend a lot of time at Sabino Canyon, and as you're talking about the nursery effect, there's nothing better than Sabino Canyon to display the nursery effect with, the trees and the cacti and everything growing there, and even if you get no rain, they seem to survive in some way, shape, or form. So there's magic and secrets to me on there.
Yes. So I wanted to thank both of you again for leaving us at the end of the year with a wealth of new information, a lot of thinking, new thinking to be done. And as Marie Antoinette said, if you don't have cake, eat tomatoes. So please have some tomatoes. Thank you all for coming, and see you next year.
It's the best.